Hello cats and dogs. As it is spooky Halloween season, I figured that I would make another horror story compilation from some of my past true scary story narrations. I hope you enjoy. Also, most people who watch my channel don't actually subscribe to it, and I post new horror story narrations all the time. So if you're into that sort of content, hit that subscribe button. It's completely free, it only takes 2 seconds, and you can always change your mind if you don't like the content in the future. Okay, now onto the video. I work at a restaurant in a small town, and I have been locking up at the end of the night for over a year now. It's nice, easy money, and I usually get paid an extra hour while doing simple tasks like cleaning or rolling silverware. It's actually calming after a hectic night in the kitchen. I never check bathrooms or anything before locking up. Usually, the restaurant is empty well before I'm finished, and I have a lot of time to myself. There is something so eerie about being in a restaurant alone after closing. What was once a bustling place full of people is now empty and silent. The sounds of the machinery kicking on can be heard across the restaurant. The sound of the ice machine dumping ice usually makes me jump. With the layout of the restaurant, the main light switches are on the opposite side of the restaurant from the door with the alarm. So, I usually lock the back and front doors, and then turn off all of the lights. Then, I make my way through the dark restaurant to the side door, which has the keypad. In order to arm the system, all doors need to be closed, and there needs to be no movement in the restaurant. If there is an error, it will tell me the door that is open, or infrared detected, and the area where there is movement. When I first started locking up, I needed the flashlight on my phone to navigate to the door, but now, I know the layout, so I just walk in the darkness. For some reason, it is less scary to just speed walk through the dark than to have a dimly lit phone light casting shadows and reflecting off surfaces. I hate to say it as a grown man, but the dark creeps me out. Tonight, the restaurant had been closed for almost 2 hours. I mopped the kitchen, cleaned a bit, and rolled some silverware for the morning crew. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and then made my way through the dark restaurant to the door. I typed in the code and got an error. Error, infrared detected, dining room. I felt my stomach sink. I know I've been alone in this restaurant for 2 hours. I know I had just walked through that pitch black dining room. Just then, I heard footsteps pounding on the tile, coming towards me from the dining room. I've gotten chills down my spine before when something creeps me out, but this was different. It felt like my entire nervous system was overloaded. I didn't even turn around. I just opened the door and bolted out into the parking lot. I didn't hear any footsteps behind me. I got in my car and peeled out. I drove down the street and called 911, and then I called my boss. I waited until they arrived before I went back to the restaurant. The door was wide open. There was no sign of anyone. Nothing was stolen, nothing was broken. I gave a report of what happened, and that was it. The only interior camera, which is pointed at the cash registers, doesn't see into a majority of the dining room, but the exterior camera recorded something that scared the shit out of me, and that I will think about for the rest of my life. It captures me running out of the building and around the corner to my car. Shortly after I exited, you could barely see the elongated shadow of someone standing by the door beneath the camera, watching me run away. The person casting it was just out of frame before turning the opposite direction and disappearing. Just seeing my terrified self running away, and that shadow watching me do so, I've never felt so vulnerable. I'm not really a believer in the paranormal, but I just don't know what kind of sick person would wait in a restaurant for 2 hours after close, not steal anything, and just scare the employee locking up. I know for a fact it wasn't any of my co-workers. Obviously, there wasn't much that could be done to find out who it was. Nothing shows anyone entering the building after close. And from what we could tell, everyone who entered that day had left. This event still has me questioning myself on whether it was a sick prank, someone mentally ill, or something supernatural. Recently, I had the most disturbing experience of my life. For context, I will give a little backstory. My husband had remained close to his childhood friend, who I will call John, well into adulthood. They had met in elementary school and became inseparable ever since. When I was dating my husband and met John, I thought he was such a nice guy. He had a really docile nature and wholesome character. Everyone felt comfortable around him. John was the type of person that could get along with anyone. He was trustworthy, dependable, and genuinely kind. I was happy that my husband was able to keep such a good friend in this day and age, when true friendships are so hard to find. Both me and my husband are estranged from our families, so we were very lucky to have someone like John in our lives. We considered him our family. John was a nerd like us, so we had many of the same interests. We would meet up every once in a while to grab something to eat, catch a movie, or just hang out at the house playing retro board games and discussing tech. We all three had a love of computers, so my husband and John often shared with each other small programs that they would write. My husband and I built computers for a time, and John would come by to give his opinion and advise us on our projects. I suppose the only curious thing about John was that he never had a girlfriend. In all the years we knew him, he had always been single. He never even dated. I didn't understand why such a nice guy hadn't found someone yet. Our lives seemed to evolve and change, but John sort of just stayed where he had always been, living with his family and never becoming involved with anyone romantically. For a while, we started thinking that maybe he was just gay and simply scared to reveal it because he had a pretty traditional family, who he was very close to. Though we wondered amongst ourselves, we never brought it up to him, as it seemed inappropriate. It would be like we were invading his privacy or meddling in his life. We figured that he would eventually find someone when he was ready. John suddenly moved away to a city that was 3 hours away. When he told us, we thought at first that he had decided to finally move on his own, but we were wrong. He had actually moved into a home that his older sister had bought for her retirement. Since she wasn't ready to retire just yet, she was letting him stay there for the time being. And that's when things began to change. John sort of fell off the map. He wouldn't call, he wouldn't visit or ask us to come visit him. My husband and I figured that it was because of the distance. Also, he was probably settling into his new place and getting accustomed to a new city. But time continued passing, and I could tell my husband was really missing his friend. I had to admit that I was too. We had such good times together, and it was so unlike John to disconnect like that. It was so difficult to get in contact with him on the phone, and he wasn't very active on his social media either. I started to worry about John. I also didn't want my husband to continue distancing himself from his best friend, as it could become permanent. So I made it my mission to reignite our friendship. I called John and arranged for us to go visit him. Surprisingly, he didn't seem to even acknowledge the fact that it had been about 2 years since we had last seen each other. When we arrived at his place, I was taken a little aback, as I hadn't been expecting what I saw. The house was in a pretty secluded neighborhood, in the middle of nowhere actually. I didn't know how he could get used to it here, coming from a big city and all. Also, and I hate to say this, but the house seemed dirty and messy. John told us that he had transferred his job to this new city, and even though they offered him a promotion, he had declined it. He didn't want to work the extra hours. I looked around and thought that this made sense, since it seemed like John didn't like leaving the house very much. I chuckled to myself as I thought the house looked more like a bunker than a home. To my dismay, I saw that John had his own room, as if he was still a teenager. In fact, it was decorated as if that is what he still was. It was a mess in there. Computers and computer equipment on the floor, wires everywhere, clothes thrown around all over the place. John said his sister came to stay every other weekend, so she had the main bedroom for herself. He expressed how he hated for his privacy to be interrupted when she stayed over, but what could he do? I thought to myself that he could just get his own place, but I didn't say it out loud. We all decided to go to dinner and browse some of the stores in the area. I couldn't help myself any longer and asked John why we had lost contact. It had become so difficult to get a hold of him lately. He kind of shrugged it off and said that he had been so busy with the move that he must have lost track of time. He didn't ever want to lose contact like that with us again. He appeared genuine, but something felt off to me. His answers appeared too short and generic, as if they had been scripted or practiced somehow. My husband told him that he thought he would have had his own place by now since he moved all the way out here. John said that it was just financially easier this way. Again, another short and generic reply. I asked him if he was seeing anyone. He said that he wasn't in a position to do so right now, as he really wanted to get his finances in order first. I thought that every reply he gave made sense and was perfectly reasonable, but I also knew he was lying. Rather, he was hiding. I just didn't know what. It was just this nagging feeling that I couldn't shake off. John just didn't seem like the person we had known once. My husband and I drove back home kind of confused, but glad that we had spent some time with our friend. It had been a long time coming. John certainly had answered all the questions we had been curious about. We believed that now we had resumed contact, we would see more of him, but that didn't happen. John continued to be distant. His social media continued to not be updated. But I did notice something strange. Since I have him as a friend, I could see whatever he did that was public. I noticed he was liking Nickelodeon programs and would sometimes make comments on their posts. The comments would just mention how good a show's last episode was, or how he couldn't wait to find out what would happen next. I found this odd. His comments almost seemed to be written by someone much younger, and not a man in his late 30s. Who still watched kids' programs at that age? Oh well. I chalked it up to John always being sort of innocent. Besides, some adults still watch cartoons, right? I suppose there isn't anything too weird then, with an adult liking children's sitcoms. I didn't mention it to my husband. I'm not sure why. I just felt like I was invading John's privacy somehow. After all, it's not like I had purposefully searched for this information. Besides, what would be the point of even mentioning it? It was just TV shows. Over the next couple of years, John visited us one time. Once again, I had to make a monumental effort to get him to meet with us, even though he travelled our way to visit his mother often. I got the uncanny feeling that John was avoiding us. Again, as if he was hiding. But hiding what? My husband had pretty much accepted the fact that this friendship had somehow grown apart and things would never be as they were before. No point in continuing to force the situation. I resigned myself to that fact as well. It happens. I figured it happened more commonly with childhood friends, since people do tend to go in different directions in adulthood. Some more time passed, and my husband mentioned John to me. He told me that he wondered what he had been up to and how it seemed how hard he tried. He kept losing contact with him. I could tell my husband was annoyed and wouldn't call John because he was upset. I decided to give him a call myself. I hoped he still had his same number, and luckily, he did. John informed me that he had recently moved back in with his mother. She needed him to be close to her due to her ailing health. I told him it was good that he was back, because we were planning on visiting my father, so we could swing by and see him as well. For the first time, John actually sounded strained and evasive. For the first time, John actually sounded strained and evasive. He didn't sound like himself at all. He told me that he really hadn't been expecting to move back, so he was having trouble getting settled in. For this reason, he said that he would not be able to meet with us this soon. We would have to meet the following month. That struck me as strange, since his mother's house was the house he grew up in. He had his own bedroom there, so why would it be so difficult to settle in? I accepted his wishes though, and told him that the following month, we would plan on hanging out for sure. Nothing could have prepared me and my husband for what happened next. As the month we were supposed to meet approached, my husband called me to come downstairs and look at the TV. He then said to hurry. I thought he was just being dramatic, since he sometimes did so to come and see what he was watching. So I reluctantly went downstairs. I immediately noticed he was as white as a sheet. Now, he had my attention. I asked him what in the world was wrong now. He told me to look at this as he held the remote in his hand, pointing it to the TV. I sat down next to him, and he started playing a news segment that showed a courtroom. Suddenly, John is led in by a bailiff. wearing an orange suit with his hands and feet shackled. I literally did a double take, as I couldn't at first believe it was the same person. I thought my husband was joking and was playing a video showing a John look-alike, but there was no denying it was really him. His full name was right on the screen. The newscaster said that yet another man, John, had just been arrested in connection to one of the largest child trafficking rings that had been dismantled in recent history. John was just one of the many individuals who had been caught when the police successfully obtained their information from a website on the dark web that had been shut down for featuring and spreading child pornography. The investigation had been going on for a few years. Both of our mouths were wide open as we stared at the TV in disbelief. My husband told me that he had been searching for a local TV show when he came across this. He told me he just couldn't believe it. He must have watched it over 20 times before he called me downstairs to see for myself. I was speechless. Sometime later, when the initial shock subsided, my husband went online to search for more information, and it appears that John's mother's home and sister's home had both been raided, and they found hundreds of child sexual abuse content on his computer. John must have been collecting them since his youth. There had also been a DNA match. There wasn't much more information than that, and I was thankful for it, because none of us wanted to know what that meant exactly. John is going to be in prison for the next 30 plus years. He will be an old man by the time he makes it to his first parole hearing, and would have to wear an ankle monitor for his remaining years if he was ever to be released. We saw that his sister removed his name from the house she had bought. She also removed every mention of him from her social media. For his family to have disowned him, the details of what John did must be truly horrific, and it's obvious that his family has no doubt of his guilt. I feel so sorry for his poor mother. She was such a sweet lady. She had already lost 2 sons, and now she lost a third one. My husband and I removed John from our contact list and any trace of him from our social media as well. We severed all ties. We decided to not even contact his family. We will not be visiting him in prison either, though we have so many unanswered questions. This event broke my husband somehow. He has become very paranoid and distrustful of other people. He has refused to make any new friends. I can understand him. It's life-changing when you realize you never truly know anyone, regardless of how close you are to them. Not really. The sweet, humble guy that had slept in our home and shared so many great times with us had been an illusion. A very good magic trick. It's as if he had never really existed, except in our own minds. John had been hiding something after all. He had been hiding that he was really a monster. Before we get going, I just want to get one thing out of the way. This is not my story. It actually belongs to my best friend's little brother. He gave me permission to use it so long as I didn't use the real names of the people involved, with the exception of the guilty party in question. So, my best friend and her younger brother, who I will call Rebecca and Alex for the sake of the story, moved across the country from Connecticut to California because their father had a stroke, and he needed help with recovery and household tasks. At the time, Alex was in a long-term relationship with his then-girlfriend, and he knew she wasn't going to handle the news well. Keep in mind, the two of them had been together since middle school, and on more than one occasion she had mentioned that she wasn't the long-distance relationship type. So, he was bracing himself for the eventual breakup, and as he suspected, it happened. Just not in the way he thought it would. He expected her to be just as upset as him, but instead, she was eerily calm, almost relieved even. She breathed a sigh of relief before dropping the bombshell that she'd been planning on breaking up anyway because, for over a year, she had been having a secret affair with his cousin. Rebecca found this out and she hit the roof, ending up telling me the whole thing over one of our weekly video chats. She confronted him over the whole thing, and he had almost the same reaction, owning up to everything. So now, Alex was dealing with the heartbreak of losing his long-term girlfriend, and the cousin, who he always thought had his back, and the stark realization that this entire time, that cousin and the girl he thought loved him unconditionally were really looking for a place to bury the proverbial dagger. As you would imagine, he took it about as well as any of us. He barely said anything the entire cross-country trip with his sister, and she practically had to beg him to eat while they were on the road. He fell into a pretty deep depression. A couple of weeks go by, and once they've settled in, I get that long-awaited video chat notification from Rebecca. We maybe chat for 2 or 3 minutes when she asks me if I would have any issues talking to Alex. Of course, I didn't mind. If we're being honest, I've been a part of that kid's life since the day he was born. Though not by blood, he was always more of a little brother to me as well. So I figured maybe some guy talk would do him a bit of good. That is, as long as he was up for it. Thankfully, it seemed as if he was willing to talk, even if just for a few minutes. So his sister left the room and Alex sat in the computer chair. The very first thing out of my mouth was, "How are you holding up?" He was quiet for a minute, but then I saw his lower lip trembling and a tear roll out of his eye. Before I could get another word in edgewise, he absolutely lost it. I was as supportive as I could be. I told him to let it out, told him it was okay, told him that I had been where he was before in my younger years. And I remembered how bad it hurt. I'd been cheated on in the past, and at the very least, in my case, a family member wasn't involved. But I had lost people I considered friends due to this, and in that sense, I did understand the sense of dual betrayal. After a few minutes, he collected himself and told me everything that had been going through his head, everything he neglected to tell his sister. I won't get into too many details because it was rather personal, and I promised him I wouldn't, but let's just say, things got a bit dark. Before I signed off with him and continued an admittedly short conversation with his sister, I let him know that he could come to me for any reason whatsoever, because as far as I was concerned, he was family. Always would be. I also assured him that he would weather this. He was only 20 after all, and a fairly good-looking guy. Not to mention he had a good heart and just needed to give himself some time to heal. He gave me a slight smile and a nod, and I had a feeling that that was the first time he had smiled in a bit. Rebecca and I finished off our short catching-up session, and I went to bed for the night. The time zone difference basically made it so I was getting off of the call a little after 11 PM, my time. I had to be at work the next morning. For a little over a month, the conversation alternated between Rebecca and Alex, and they would tell me everything that they were experiencing out in California. The status of their father's health, fun activities they got to do in the rare instances that they had downtime, and eventually, Alex told me he was thinking about dating. I wasn't one of those individuals that was going to harp on him about his inexperience or the fact that it was too soon. I just told him to be careful. He openly admitted to me that he wasn't looking for anything more than a rebound because he hadn't been with anybody other than his ex, so he wasn't looking to get into anything serious. I asked if he'd met anyone just yet. After all, he was still new to the area, so I was curious. He told me no. Mentioned he attempted to talk to a girl at a Starbucks, not too far up the road, but she seemed disinterested, so he didn't pursue it any further. At this point, he was relying on some of the more well-known dating apps, such as Tinder and Coffee Meets Bagel, but hadn't had much luck. So now he was trying out an app called Meet Me. I asked him what made it so different from all the other apps he'd been trying out, and he told me that it wasn't just a typical dating app. It actually gave him a series of places and events where he could potentially meet somebody, and at the very least, have a good time. Personally, it sounded like a good idea to me. He was new to the area, after all, and by his own admission, the furthest he had been since moving to his dad's was to the Starbucks and the little convenience store about 2 miles away. So he was going into it with the mindset of, even if a date doesn't come out of this, at least I might find something I enjoy. For the next 3 weeks or so, our conversations continued as per usual. No real update from Alex in regards to the dating situation, but about a month later, he greeted me on the other end of the chat instead of his sister, and he was beaming. He told me he met a woman by the name of Lena on the app. They chatted for a little over a week, and he realized that they clicked. He didn't mind that she was a little bit older, and by a little bit, I mean 16 years his senior. But throughout the few conversations, he found they have a bit in common. She would eventually talk him into meeting up at a music appreciation club meeting at a rec centre not too far away from him. He held up his phone to the camera, and I waited for the picture to focus a bit more. But from what I could see, she was quite pretty. She didn't look her age. If anything, she could have passed for being in her mid-20s. She had a kind of punk rock aesthetic to her look. Slender, with a Monroe piercing, a black pixie cut hairstyle, and a little dimple in her chin. She was rocking an AFI t-shirt and had a smile that gave off the impression that she was fun. I could understand why he gave her a shot. If I were in the same position, I probably would have done the same thing, especially since that was my type when I was his age. He went on to tell me that he started to bond with her within the first couple of hours of their initial meetup. They chatted about their mutual love of the albums Black Sails in the Sunset, Answer That, and Stay Fashionable, and The Art of Drowning. They talked about all of the music that helped them through tough situations and became their overall life soundtrack. He knew that he had found a kindred soul, at least in this sense, when she started naming off some of the more obscure bands like Domin and Calabrese. I advised him to be careful at first and not to fall too hard. Told him it was a good idea to get to know her a bit better, especially since he was just getting out of a rough breakup. When I gave him this advice, I realized it kind of came across as unwanted, because he gave me a look like I was insulting his intelligence, but after a few seconds, he just thanked me and told me he would keep me posted. He stuck to his word, because every chance he had, he would talk about Lena and tell me about how she would take him on day trips when she found out he wasn't from the area. They went everywhere from the Sunset Strip to Venice Beach. She even took him to go out and see Alcatraz. It would be 4 to 5 months of these conversations before one day he told me that she finally admitted to having feelings for him. He wasn't sure how to process this information at first, mostly due to the fact that he was under the impression that they were just friends. But after talking to her and finally telling her everything he had gone through with his previous breakup, he admitted that he would be willing to give it a shot because he really liked her company. Upon hearing this, she gave him a passionate kiss. As he blushed, he told me that one thing led to another, and, well, you know, he didn't have to go into too much detail past that point. I could see the sheepish look on his face combined with a boyish grin. Still, I asked him if he was sure he was making the right move. He told me I was overthinking things and he was just going to see where it went from there. It wasn't like he was going to be proposing to her anytime soon. I just said okay, and in a way, I gave him my blessing before ending my conversation with him and speaking with Rebecca. She waited for him to leave the room before chatting with me, and once she realized he was out of earshot, she said with more than a slight hint of uneasiness in her voice that she couldn't shake the feeling that this was going to end badly. When I asked her what she meant, she told me she found the whole situation creepy. She even pointed out that if somebody like me or her father were doing the same thing, it wouldn't be treated the same way. Though she acknowledged the obvious and very real double standard, I reminded her that Alex seemed smitten with Lena, and that he was technically an adult. She said yeah, in an almost defeated way, and let me know that she would see how things played out, hoping her gut instinct was wrong. Sadly, it wasn't. As the conversations continued, Alex would tell me how Lena finally came over and met the family in person. His dad seemed okay with everything and was honestly relieved that his son was dating someone with much more life experience. Rebecca was more standoffish, but did her best to hold her tongue. As much as she wanted to confront Lena that night, she didn't, for her brother's sake. Alex would talk to me, and in some of those instances, especially when he looked tired, he would allude to the fact that Lena was keeping him up at night without getting into too much detail. Apparently, it was quite often, and in some instances, way more adventurous than he could have imagined. One night, he told me that they were planning a day trip to San Francisco just so they could take some rides on the trolley cars and check out places like Hyde and Ashbury. He seemed really jazzed about the whole thing. The usual routine of bidding him good night and wishing him well before talking to his sister went on as per usual, and the conversation was relatively normal. So when I didn't hear back from them for close to a couple of weeks, I started to worry. This was highly unusual because these weekly video chats were almost on a schedule. I started to wonder if their dad had another health crisis. I sent a few messages on WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger to try to get down to the bottom of things. After my third or fourth attempt, Rebecca finally answered back with, "Sorry, had a lot going on as of late. I'll fill you in later." That evening, my computer screen signed in with that all too familiar tone once again. I still remember, I was in the middle of microwaving a few slices of pizza from the night before, and I darted into my computer room, deciding to forego eating until I had an understanding of what exactly had kept them from speaking to me for what felt like an extended period. The first thing out of my mouth when Rebecca came up on my screen was, "Is your dad okay?" She assured me that he was doing okay as far as his health was concerned, but then she said he was just as pissed as she was. I'm pretty sure I looked confused at that statement because she launched into a tirade about Lena. It was all over the place. She punched the desk a couple of times, and she was so furious I could barely make out what she was saying. I asked her to take a breath for a minute and start over, but instead of doing so, she just told me it would have been easier to just have Alex explain it. So she got up from her chair and walked out of the room for a moment, coming back with Alex in tow. He was wearing a hoodie, the hood pulled up, and trying his best not to look at the camera, but when he sat down, my heart sank. The hoodie did little to cover his face. There were signs of healing bruises around his throat and face. His left eye was absolutely bloodshot, and there were signs of freshly healed stitches across his chin, directly under his lower lip. The bridge of his nose was terribly swollen, and when he waved at me, I could see he was wearing a couple of finger braces and a tightly wrapped ace bandage on his right hand. "What in the blue hell happened to you?" I asked, not even thinking about the words coming out of my mouth. He told me that he didn't want to talk about it, but Rebecca forced him to do so. For the next 20 minutes, he told me the story of the San Francisco trip. Everything was going great at first. We grabbed some tie-dyes from a shop run by a couple of old hippies, rode the trolley around town, and did everything we wanted to do by lunch. By that time, we were getting really hungry, so we stopped at a little cafe with an outdoor patio. He swallowed hard, and as he did, I could tell it caused him a bit of physical pain. He started to cry a little bit. As he took a moment to collect himself and choke back the tears, he continued, "The big reason we were doing this was because it was my 21st birthday, and she wanted to celebrate with me. So, we're having a couple of sangrias and waiting for a light lunch when I start noticing her acting kind of funny. She starts looking at the ground, trying to cover her face with her hand, and telling me not to look. I have no clue what she's talking about, but then I hear this guy who didn't sound like he was too far from the restaurant, and his voice is getting closer. He starts screaming tramp and slut, and Lena just jumped out of the chair and grabbed my arm in a panic. She was screaming for us to go, and I looked over my shoulder to see this guy who looked like a walking billboard for HGH. He was steadily screaming at her, and when I asked who he was, she just blurted out, "My husband." I'll tell you, man, my feet were suddenly stuck to the ground. I couldn't move thanks to the shock of hearing that. And then the next thing I knew, I'm being pulled over the wall and pinned to the ground by my neck while this guy repeatedly punches me in the face and screams at her. If one of the girls at the restaurant hadn't had pepper spray at the time, I probably wouldn't be here talking to you right now. I just sat there in utter shock. Rebecca told me she had a gut feeling about Lena, and I had dismissed it like she was being an overprotective sister. Now Alex was sitting there on camera with obvious signs that he had taken the pummeling of his life, because the woman he was dating was lying to him the entire time. He went on to tell me that, thanks to the restaurant's security cameras, they were able to positively ID his assailant. Lena went completely radio silent after that day. She wasn't at the music appreciation club. He didn't see her around town, and he began to suspect that her husband may have done something to her. That fear was put to rest when they were visited by the police officers handling his case, and they informed him that she had skipped town and ended up going to her parents' place in Oildale. She was subpoenaed to show up in court in order to give an account of what had happened. Rebecca and her dad kept me in the loop with everything that happened from that point forward. Her husband was charged with assault and battery and stalking. I don't quite remember how long he was sentenced, but a good portion of it was suspended with the condition that he take an anger management class and undergo court-ordered counseling. During the proceedings, Alex and the rest of the family would find out that she had a habit of doing this kind of thing, and that he wasn't the first young buck that she had run around with behind her husband's back. Her husband had served her with divorce papers, but she refused to sign them. She continued on with this behavior, and by the time he realized she was doing it again, he began tailing her and biding his time. He'd seen them during one of their day trips and put two and two together. He made the decision to continue following her after one of her and Alex's hotel room sessions. He openly admitted to losing his temper and attacking the wrong person that fateful day in San Francisco. Rebecca still feels as if the judge went a little easier on him than he should have because he admitted wrongdoing, but the fact remains that he more or less admitted in court that he should have attacked his wife without actually saying it. Alex and I would talk quite a bit more, this time just one-on-one after the court proceedings. He went on to tell me that somewhere in between being choked out on a San Francisco sidewalk and having the bridge of his nose reset in the emergency room, he has come to the decision that maybe online dating wasn't for him. It's been a couple of years since all of this went down, and thankfully, he's healed well both physically and mentally. He continued going to the music appreciation club because it brought him a sense of peace, despite being where him and Lena initially met. He made a few good friends during his time there, and a few of them introduced him to other activities in the area. He started taking a cooking class, and that's where he befriended the girl he is dating now. She too is older than him, but thankfully only by a year. They don't have a whole lot in common other than a few movies and some nerdy interests, but she is upfront and honest with him about a lot of things. She insisted they take their time and seems to have her head on straight. I just hope if things get serious, they go far better for Alex. He didn't deserve what happened to him, especially since it could have been avoided if Lena hadn't lied to him from the start. It was one of those cool autumn nights that felt like the season had finally settled in. The air had a bite to it, and the sky was that deep, inky blue that you only get this time of year. We had just finished watching the big game at our high school. The stands were still packed, but most of the kids were gone now, heading off to some house party or whatever. Not us. Me, Jake, Sam and Tyler decided to hang out on the empty football pitch after everyone had cleared out. The floodlights lit up the field, casting these long shadows behind us as we tossed around the ball. We had no plans, just four bored guys trying to avoid going home to deal with parents. I should have known something felt off when Sam kept looking back towards the parking lot, but I shrugged it off. "Dude, relax," Jake said, catching the ball and spinning it on his finger. "Ain't nobody left?" Sam shrugged. "I don't know, man. I thought I saw a car pull in." Tyler laughed, smacking Sam on the back. "You scared of a couple headlights?" We all chuckled, but I noticed it too. Off near the edge of the lot, there was a car. A beat-up old sedan. It was just sitting there, engine off. No big deal, right? Except the way that it was parked made it look like it was angled at us, watching. "You're right," I said, pointing. "That car's weird though, why would it still be here?" Tyler scoffed and threw the ball at me. "Probably waiting for someone to finish cleaning up or something, who cares?" But Sam wasn't convinced. "It wasn't there before, I swear." We started walking towards the edge of the field, heading back to the parking lot where Jake had his truck. That's when we heard the engine roar to life behind us. The car's headlights flicked on, high beams glaring in our direction. We froze. "Bro, they're looking at us," I whispered. Jake turned around slowly. "Alright, let's not freak out, it could be coincidence, right?" Just as he said that, the car revved its engine, jerking forward a little before stopping. My gut twisted. They were messing with us. "Let's just walk back to the truck, no running," Jake said, trying to stay cool. But Tyler was already speeding up, his hands jammed into his pockets. Sam, wide-eyed, followed, his breath picking up pace. The car's engine roared again, and this time, it shot forward a good 30 feet, headlights blazing, tires crunching over the gravel.
"Hey!"
A voice from inside the car yelled.
"Where you boys going? Thought I'd have a little fun."
The voice was rough, slurred like the guy was drunk or something. We all looked at each other, panic setting in now.
"Just ignore them, man,"
Jake muttered under his breath.
"Keep walking."
But the car sped up again, now closing the gap between us and them. They were right behind us. The windows were down, and I caught a glimpse of the guy in the passenger's seat. Bald, pale skin, and these sunken eyes that locked onto me. There was another guy in the driver's seat as well, grinning like a maniac. He had a lit cigarette hanging out of his mouth, blowing smoke in our direction as the car crept closer.
"Yo, you kids scared?"
The bald guy called out, laughing. Jake broke.
"Run!"
We bolted. We cut across the field, not even looking back. The car peeled out, tires screeching as it followed, the engine roaring louder than it had any right to. I heard the car's doors open for a second, like they were about to get out, but then they just gunned it again, right towards us.
"What the hell, man?"
Sam screamed, his voice cracking. I could feel the panic clawing at my chest, my legs burning as we sprinted. We weren't fast enough. There was no way we could outrun a car, and we all knew it. Tyler, always the fastest, made it to the trees at the end of the field first. He dove behind one, panting and yelling for us to follow. I was right behind him, but I glanced back. Jake and Sam were still running, but the car was swerving now, cutting them off, the headlights blinding them. The bald guy leaned out of the window, something glinting in his hand. A bat.
"Run faster, boys!"
He yelled, laughing again. I don't know how, but Jake managed to dive out of the way just before the car reached him. Sam wasn't so lucky. The car clipped him, knocking him to the ground. He let out this horrible scream as he rolled onto the grass, clutching his leg.
"No, Sam!"
I shouted, running toward him without thinking. The car screeched to a stop, and I saw the door fly open. The bald guy got out, swinging the bat lazily, like he was just warming up.
"Looks like we got ourselves a couple of tough guys,"
he sneered, walking towards Sam. I froze, my heart pounding so hard it drowned out everything else. Jake ran up, grabbing Sam by the arm and trying to drag him away, but Sam couldn't move fast enough. The bald guy grinned, raising the bat.
"Time for a little lesson, huh?"
That's when Tyler came out of nowhere, throwing a rock at the guy's head. It hit him square in the forehead, and he stumbled back, cursing loudly.
Go! Go, now!
Tyler shouted. Jake and I grabbed Sam and ran, dragging him as fast as we could towards the trees. The bald guy was still shouting, but I didn't look back. I couldn't. We just kept running until the sound of the car finally faded, and we were swallowed by the dark woods. We didn't stop until we made it to the road on the other side. By then, we were all gasping for air, Sam barely able to stand.
What the hell was that, man?
Jake muttered, looking back towards the field.
Who were they?
I didn't have an answer. None of us did. All I knew is that we barely made it out of there. And every time I think about that night, I can still hear the sound of that car engine roaring behind us and those guys laughing like it was all some sick game. I still can't go to fall festivals without feeling that cold pit in my stomach. The one that reminds me of the night that everything almost changed forever. I was 9, and like most kids my age, I loved everything about fall. The cool air, the pumpkins, the smell of cinnamon and bonfires. That year, my mum took me to one of those local fall festivals. You know, the kind with hay rides, caramel apples, and games that no one ever really wins. It started out normal. We had just gotten there, and I remember holding on to my mum's hand while we walked through the stalls. People were everywhere, and the air smelt like fried dough and roasted corn. The sun had just started to dip behind the trees, casting everything in its warm, golden light. Mum was chatting with a vendor about some homemade candles when I noticed a booth nearby that had these giant stuffed animals hanging from the ceiling. They were huge, almost bigger than me, and I couldn't resist.
"I'll be right back,"
I told her, thinking that it would be a quick detour.
"Stay where I can see you,"
she said, barely glancing up. But of course, I didn't listen. I darted through the crowd, making a beeline for the stuffed animals. I squeezed between two people, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the booth, staring up at this massive plush bear. I felt like I was in a different world, surrounded by flashing lights and the noise of people laughing, shouting, music blaring from the speakers. When I turned back around, Mum wasn't there. I couldn't even see her anymore. I called out, but the sound of the festival swallowed my voice. The crowd seemed to thicken around me, and that's when I realized how small I really was. Faces blurred together, and no one seemed familiar. That's when she appeared, a woman, maybe in her late 30s, with long dark hair pulled back into a messy ponytail. Came up to me. She was smiling, but something about the way her eyes looked didn't feel right. They were too wide and too eager. I didn't answer right away. My throat tightened, and I started to feel my chest constrict as if someone had wrapped a fist around my lungs. I looked around again, searching the sea of people, but my mum was gone. The crowd swallowed her whole. The woman's fingers brushed against my arm, just enough for me to feel the coldness of her skin. I stepped back, but she grabbed me. Her grip wasn't soft anymore. She held on tightly, fingers digging into my arm. Before I knew what was happening, she yanked me towards the edge of the festival grounds. I didn't even have time to scream. The sounds of the festival, the music, the laughter grew distant as she dragged me through the crowd. My feet scrambled to keep up, but her grip on me was unyielding. I tried pulling away, but her fingers only tightened. My mind went blank, all my thoughts wiped away by raw, animal instinct that screamed at me to run. We'd broken free from the crowd, the lights from the festival now a soft glow in the distance. That's when I saw it. Parked just beyond the last row of booths was a van, its engine idling, headlights dim. There was a man behind the wheel, staring straight at us. He was grinning, and the passenger door was already open. My whole body felt numb as the woman kept pulling me toward the van, her pace quickening. My feet barely touched the ground, my shoes dragging through the dirt. The man in the van never stopped smiling, his face illuminated by the dashboard lights. There was something on the seat next to him. Rope. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might tear itself apart. I knew what was going to happen if I got into that van. I didn't know how I knew, but I did. Every part of my body screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but I couldn't. My limbs felt like lead, heavy and useless. We were just steps away from the van when everything seemed to slow down. I heard footsteps, loud and urgent, coming from behind me. Someone was shouting, but it was loud, distant, like I was underwater. The woman froze, her hands still locked around my arm. I could feel her fingers tremble as she hesitated. Then, suddenly, the weight on my arm vanished. I was yanked backward, away from her, away from the van, and I fell to the ground. The next few minutes were a blur.
Flashing lights, shouting voices, and rough hands pulling the woman away.
I saw her face as they took her, contorted with anger, eyes wild. She was screaming something, but I couldn't make out the words. All I could do was sit there, watching her disappear into the crowd. The van peeled away, its tires screeching on the pavement, but it didn't get far. More flashing lights, more shouting. They caught him too. I don't remember much after that, just the feeling of my mum's arms around me, holding me tight. I was shaking, but she didn't let go. Not until I finally stopped crying. Even now, as an adult, I can still feel that woman's grip on my arm, her nails biting into my skin. And I can still see that van in my nightmares, the way the man behind the wheel smiled at me, like I was already his. I don't go to fall festivals anymore. I can't. Not after that night. It was the perfect fall day, crisp air, the sky clear blue, and the leaves blazing in colours. Me and my girlfriend Kelly were headed to the local apple orchard, a spot that I had visited every year to pick apples for my mum's famous pies. Today, though, felt a little off. The orchard was nearly empty. The parking lot, usually packed, had only one old beat-up truck parked far away. I didn't let it bother me though, and we headed towards the trees with our basket. The orchard looked beautiful, but the silence was strange. We walked amongst the rows of apple trees, picking fruit and talking about how great the pie would be. But then I heard it, a whisper, barely audible, saying my name. I turned around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one in sight. I told myself it was probably just the wind, but the whispers kept coming, more frequently. Every time I heard my name, it was clearer and more urgent, like someone was right behind me. I tried to ignore it and focused on the apples, but the eerie feeling just wouldn't go away. Kelly suddenly stopped and stared at something in the distance. I looked and saw her, an old woman standing at the end of the row, her back hunched and her face hidden under a dark hat. She was standing motionless, just staring at us. The sight was disturbing. Her presence felt completely out of place. We kept moving, but the creepy feeling only got worse. The whispers grew louder, now clearly calling our names, echoing around us. It felt like the shadows were getting darker, the air colder. I could almost feel eyes on us watching from the trees. Kelly squeezed my hand as we quickened our pace. The orchard, which had always been a familiar place, now seemed alien and threatening. We grabbed a few apples, not caring about the amount, and hurried to the car. The engine roared to life, and we sped away from the orchard. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the old woman following us, but she was nowhere in sight. We made it home with just a few apples and a feeling of relief. I never went back to that orchard. Some places are better left alone. It started in my sophomore year. I wasn't exactly the most popular guy, but I had a solid group of friends. We messed around after school, played some basketball, hit up parties on weekends, typical high school stuff. I wasn't interested in drama or popularity contests, but I'll admit, I noticed when people outside my circle gave me attention. That's where Emily came in. She wasn't popular. Hell, I'm not even sure she had any real friends. She sat by herself at lunch, always in the back of the classroom, never really talking. She just watched. I didn't think much of her at all, to be honest. Just another quiet girl keeping to herself. One afternoon after class, she approached me out of nowhere.
Hey, can I get your Snapchat?
I was thrown off. I mean, it wasn't like we ever talked before. But she looked kind of nervous, and I didn't want to be rude. So, without thinking much about it, I gave it to her. I figured she'd add me, maybe send a couple of streaks, and that would be it. I was wrong. The messages started almost immediately. At first, it was casual. Hey, or what's up, stuff like that. I'd respond out of politeness, but then it escalated. Every time I opened my phone, there was a message from Emily. Not one or two, but like 20. And they weren't just random snaps, they were needy.
Why aren't you answering? Do you hate me? What did I do wrong?
I'd reply once in a while to keep her from flipping out, but no matter what I said, it was never enough. She'd send videos of herself, staring into the camera, not saying anything, just staring with this weird half smile. It freaked me out. She even started sending snaps at night. 1, 2, sometimes 3 a.m. I stopped replying altogether, thinking that she'd eventually get the hint. But that's when things got weird. One night, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to ignore the flood of notifications. Suddenly, I got a snap from her that sent a chill down my spine. It was a picture of my house. Not just some random house that she found online. My house. The caption said,
I see you.
I sat up, my heart racing. Was she outside? How did she know where I lived? I quickly opened my blinds and looked out the window, but there was no one there. I snapped back, WTF, Emily, where are you? But no reply, just more pictures of my house. Different angles, different times of day, all sent in a row. I blocked her. I had to. The next morning, she wasn't in school. I figured maybe she had finally gotten the message and backed off. But that night, I got a text from an unknown number.
Why did you block me? You can't get rid of me that easily.
I stared at the message, my stomach sinking. How did she get my number? I ignored it, but the messages kept coming. Every night, new pictures of my house. Then, it escalated. Photos of me walking home from school, hanging with my friends, even one of me in my bedroom, taken from outside. I told my friends, but they laughed it off, saying that she was just some lonely girl with a crush. But this wasn't a crush. This was something darker, something dangerous. One night, I woke up to the sound of tapping on my window. My heart practically stopped. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I slowly pulled back the curtain, and there she was, Emily, standing in my backyard, staring up at me with that same creepy smile. Her phone was in her hand, pointing right at me, taking another picture. I shut the curtain and called the police. By the time they arrived, she was gone. But they found her phone on the ground near my window. When they went through it, they found hundreds of photos of me, most of them taken without me even knowing. She had been watching me for weeks. Emily didn't come back to school after that. I heard rumors that she was sent to some kind of institution, but no one really knew for sure. I deleted Snapchat, changed my number, and did everything that I could do to forget about her. So Emily, I hope to never see you again. It was a typical Friday night at the bar. My buddy Hayden and I were hanging out, throwing back a few beers and catching up. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary, just another night out. I could have had no idea how weird things were going to get. After we left the bar, I got home and immediately crashed on the couch. It wasn't until I went to grab my phone to set an alarm that I realized it wasn't there. I checked my pockets, flipped over the cushions, even looked in the fridge, but no luck. I figured I must have left it at the bar. I'll deal with it in the morning, I muttered to myself, too tired to care. I'll call the bar tomorrow, I thought, and I passed out. The next morning, Hayden swung by my place, looking all serious. Dude, he started. Why were we acting so weird last night? I gave him a confused look. What are you talking about, bro? After I got home, I don't remember a thing. Hayden shook his head. Nah, mate, on Snapchat. You were messaging me all night. But it wasn't like you. You kept asking if I could, remind you of my address and if I was home alone. That hit me like a punch in the gut. I hadn't touched Snapchat since before I left the bar. I shot Hayden a look. Dude, that was not me. I lost my phone last night, someone else must have it. Hayden pulled out his phone, showing me the creepy messages. Where do you live again? Are you home alone right now? A cold shiver ran down my spine. Whoever had my phone wasn't just messing around. They were trying to find out where my best friend lived. Snap maps, I said, pulling out my laptop to track the phone's location. We logged in, and there it was. My phone was still online, but the location wasn't the bar. It was in a wooden area on the outskirts of town. We looked at each other, silent for a while. It didn't make any sense. Why would someone take my phone and head into the middle of nowhere? Without thinking much, we grabbed our jackets and headed out. Curiosity, or maybe stupidity, pushed us to maybe see who had it. We drove in silence, the GPS leading us down dirt roads and through increasingly dense forest. Eventually, we had to park and continue on foot. The snap map showed it was just a little ways ahead, but the closer we got, the more off everything felt. It was pitch black, and the trees pressed in around us like they were watching. When we finally got close, Hayden stopped dead in his tracks. Look, he whispered, pointing ahead. There was a faint light flickering through the trees. We moved quietly, creeping closer until we saw it. The light was coming from my phone screen. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The phone was propped up on a log, and just as we stepped closer, the screen lit up with the flash of a photo. It took me a second to realize what had just happened. Someone had just taken a picture of us. The flash revealed 3 figures, standing a few feet away, their faces shadowed by hoods. They were just standing there, completely still, watching us. My heart dropped into my stomach. Run! Hayden hissed, and we bolted. I didn't look back. I didn't care who those guys were, or what they wanted. All I knew is that we had to get out of there. We didn't stop until we were back in the car, panting and wide-eyed. What the hell was that? Hayden gasped, his voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. All I knew is that someone, or some group, had been watching us. Maybe for longer than we realized. We got back to my place, locked the doors, and called the police. But there wasn't much they could do. My phone was gone, and so were the people who had it. I got a new phone the next day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those guys knew where we lived now. I still wonder what they wanted, what they planned to do if we hadn't run. But one thing's for sure, I'll never leave my phone behind at a bar again.
It was almost midnight, and Alyssa and I were sprawled out on my bed, phones in hand, the blue light of our screens the only thing illuminating the room. The house was completely silent. We'd spent most of the night watching dumb TikToks and laughing at random Snapchats, just enjoying the usual sleepover vibe. I was about to put my phone down when I saw it, a friend request on Snapchat from someone I didn't know. The username was Jake2003, just some random guy, and his Bitmoji was the default avatar. I didn't recognize him, but sometimes people from school added me even if we'd never talk. So I accepted it without thinking much of it. Not long after, I got a snap from him. When I opened it, the screen was completely black, except for a message.
Hey, what's up?
I stared at it for a moment, feeling something off about the whole thing. No photo, no context, just a blank message. Still, I left him on read and went back to scrolling, figuring he was just some random guy bored on a Friday night. A couple of minutes later, my phone buzzed again. Another snap from him. This time, it was a picture of a ceiling fan, with the message,
You live nearby?
I sat up straighter, feeling a creeping unease in my chest. Without replying, I opened Snap Maps and checked his location. My stomach sank when I saw his Bitmoji hovering just a few streets away. He was close, too close. I showed the screen to Alyssa. Look at this, I whispered, my voice shaky. She frowned when she saw how close he was. That's weird. You should block him. I nodded, but before I could do anything, another snap came through. This one froze the blood in my veins. The message read,
Cute house.
My heart started pounding in my chest. He had to be talking about my house. I hadn't posted anything to give him that information, and I certainly hadn't shared my location with him. But then I remembered Snap Maps had been on when I accepted his friend request. Before I could block him, a soft tapping sound echoed through the room. It was coming from the window. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Alyssa sat up, wide-eyed, as we both stared at the window, the curtains drawn, but not completely. A small sliver of the outside world peeked through the gap, and the tapping continued, light, almost polite, but insistent. I picked up my phone with shaking hands and turned on the flashlight. The beam hit the glass, and for a moment, nothing moved. But then, a face appeared, pressed right up against the window. I gasped and dropped the phone. It clattered to the floor, the flashlight flickering out as I backed away from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Alyssa was next to me, her breathing shallow and fast, both of us too terrified to move. I couldn't see him clearly, but the outline of his face, the way his breath fogged up the glass, made my stomach churn. He was standing right there, staring in at us like he belonged, like he was waiting for something. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. The chime echoed through the silent house, long and slow, dragging the moment out. Whoever this guy was, he wasn't in a hurry. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911, my hands trembling so much I could barely hold it. When the operator picked up, I whispered as quietly as I could, There's someone outside my house. He found me on Snapchat. The operator was calm, but my panic made it hard to focus on what she was saying. I could hear the sound of footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the house. He wasn't done. He was looking for another way in. The doorknob rattled downstairs. Alyssa clutched my arm and we both froze. He was trying to get inside. Time felt like it was stretching forever as we waited, terrified, listening to the soft shuffle of footsteps, the occasional thud as he tested the doors and windows. My pulse was racing, and I could barely catch my breath. It felt like any second he would break through, like the thin walls of my house weren't enough to keep him out. Then, finally, I heard them. Sirens. They started off faint, but grew louder, closer, until the flashing red and blue lights appeared outside. There was a knock at the front door. This time, the police. Alyssa and I raced downstairs, opening the door with shaking hands. The officers were there, and I felt a wave of relief crash over me, but it wasn't enough to completely erase the fear. I told them about the guy who found me through Snapchat, how he had been right outside trying to get in. They searched the yard and the area around the house, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no signs of anyone. It was like he had vanished into thin air. but I'll never forget the way his face looked pressed against the glass, watching us. And after that night, I've never turned snap maps back on.
I live in a small town, so some things that happen here may not happen in bigger places. This happened about 7 years ago. I had ordered 2 desks for my sons. My ex, their dad, had promised to come out to help them put the desks together. When the delivery man was scheduled to come, I let my ex know. He had taken the boys on a short walk and would be back any minute. My neighbour, who lives behind me, breeds and trains dogs to become guide dogs. I love those dogs. They patrol my yard and often come to me for treats and petting. Anyway, I have a rack where my boys can put their man-sized boots. The delivery man came, and I asked him if he could put the desk kits inside my home. I got a weird vibe from him. I had learned a long time ago to never ignore my instincts. He started making small talk, then asked a question that I knew wasn't appropriate. "So, do you live alone?" Instantly, my guard went up. I answered, "I wish. I have my teen sons. They often have friends coming over, like every day. Family members also visit often. Some live next door. I swear my place often feels like a revolving door of friends, neighbours, and family members constantly coming over. My boys and their dad will be here any minute." Then, he got this weird look on his face and asked if I was seeing anyone. I became extremely uncomfortable, and my instincts were screaming danger. It was hard to keep a polite face and pretend nothing was wrong. He had finished putting the desk kits in my living room and wasn't leaving. I was wondering how to be truthful but not revealing. Right as I started to say something, my boys and my ex came up. The kids ran up to tell me that their dad had taken them to the store and showed me what they got, before getting really excited about their desk kits. My neighbour's dogs came over and started growling at the delivery man when he walked out. My ex-husband got the same vibe that I had. My ex is a skilled fighter with excellent instincts, and he was on instant alert. The delivery man finally left. I was getting my phone to report it just as my ex asked me if I was going to report it. Now here's where small town living comes in. I reported it to a woman who gossips a lot, and if someone wants information, they go to her, as well as to spread an invitation to a party. She also happened to be a manager at the furniture store where the delivery man came from. I found out through her that I wasn't the only woman that had called to report or complain. He was fired. A few days later, I got a call from a couple of old busybodies who wanted more information, which I gave them since I figured that this was important enough to let others know. But holy cow, that was extremely scary for me. I grew up in a small town in Australia. My twin brother and I would frequently ride our bikes around the neighbourhood when we were growing up, around the late 2000s and early 2010s. There was this one house we'd pass that always left us uneasy. A weird and deranged looking man would sit on a camping chair and drink on the side of the road outside his house. All the grass in and around his yard was extremely overgrown and unkempt. We thought nothing of it, but we always felt the same sense of dread whenever we rode past. Several years later, around 2017, there was a news article about 2 men who had gotten into a fight, resulting in one being stabbed to death. The mugshot that came up on the news showed the man we had always found creepy. It happened in that same household that we'd frequently ride past, just a block or 2 away from mine. It might not seem like much, but it has always made my skin crawl, knowing that I came face to face with that deranged psychopath on multiple occasions, and that I only lived a short walk away. I still live there, and I've heard nothing more about it. I hope he is locked up for life. In around 2018/2019, I, 25F, at the time was 18/19, was living in Nebraska, where I grew up. I lived in the largest city in Nebraska, but it was still essentially surrounded by corn and wheat fields. The city was expanding, so rich folks started building huge houses with giant properties on the edge of town as things proceeded to grow. All of that being said, I had a good friend whose parents' house was one of those big ones, right on the blurring line between the fields and the city. My friends and I were constantly hanging out at his place because it was fun. They had tons of property to ride 4x4s on, a hot tub, a huge living room for us to watch sports and have reality TV binge sessions, etc. Plus, his parents were super cool, and we could drink out there as long as we stayed at the house. It was tons of fun, even though I was and am still quite scared of the dark. So I would just not go outside after a certain time because there was little lighting, and the nearest neighbour was about a mile away. I always felt a weird energy driving to and from his place if it was late at night, but I never had anything happen until one night. The drive out there was a long, winding two-way road that had big trees on both sides, and you pass one of the city's biggest cemeteries on the way. Barely any lighting, of course, besides the street lamps every once in a while, and very little traffic. It's all inherently a bit creepy, and I'll admit to having sped through this section of road many times to get through it as quickly as possible. This specific night was perfect spring weather, so I was driving with my windows down, listening to music, and it was around 10 p.m. I was coming around one of the curves in the road when I had to essentially slam my brakes. Right in front of me, in the middle of the road, maybe 50 yards away, was what looked like a family. Again, picture a completely pitch-black road with thick forest on both sides, and only my headlights to show what's in front of me. This was a family of 3 or 4, a tall, slim woman, an average height man, and a child. Short hair, but I couldn't tell the gender based on the clothing, and couldn't see their face, maybe around 8 years old. The mother was pushing a freaking stroller. Their clothes looked normal, not tattered, but not nice. They were also not carrying any kind of light source, meaning before I arrived behind them in my car, they had been walking in the pitch black. They were all facing away from me, walking completely silent in the middle of the street, in the same direction I was heading. I turned my music down to hear if they were speaking, had music playing, etc. They didn't. The hairs on my arms immediately stood up. I came to a stop in the road behind them, obviously, and just sat there for a moment to let them move. They seemed to be completely unaffected by me and didn't even turn their heads slightly, nor did they attempt to move out of my way. I literally thought I was going insane, or that I was dreaming. It was so surreal. Before I had time to fully process and register what I was seeing and how truly strange it was, they all at the same time stopped walking and very slowly turned to face my car. This scared the absolute shit out of me. I honestly didn't even give myself enough time to look at their faces as they turned. I immediately threw my car in reverse and sent it backward for probably a full 20 seconds before flipping a U-turn, nearly running myself off the road and booking it in the other direction. The only thing I remember noticing is that the stroller looked completely empty. This is the part that sticks in my mind the most. I've never felt terror like that in my life. I checked my rearview mirror probably 1,000 times before getting to a main road and never saw a glimpse of them. In fact, I never saw a glimpse of them ever again. I tried asking my friend and his family about it, only to essentially feel like I was insane because of the way they looked at me. Every time I tell this story, I get one of 3 reactions. They either immediately think I'm freaking cuckoo, think I'm lying, or have had something sort of similar happen to them. I really don't care if no one believes me, honestly. It was, and still is, the creepiest thing to ever happen to me. I think about it all the time. It was either some weird-ass family trying to scare the shit out of someone, a distraction for an attempted robbery/assault/ etc., or it was something more sinister. I'm going to tell myself, probably for the rest of my life, that it was the first option. This happened back in the fall of 2016. I live in a very small and rural community where everyone knows everyone. The state I live in allows for rifle mule deer buck hunting in the first week of October. Sustenance hunting is very important in the culture of my area. This fall, I was lucky enough to have drawn a buck tag. I had made plans to hunt on my grandmother's farm on this evening. Given that I am a smaller woman, I had asked my husband to go with me in case I killed something, so that he could help me pack it out. He could not go, however, due to work obligations. Fine, no problem. I have hunted this farm many times by myself. I know it like the back of my hand. I strapped on my boots, grabbed my rifle and binoculars, tucked my cell phone into my pocket, and made my way to my jeep. My grandmother's farm consists of corn, bordering an alfalfa field along a river. Between the river and the farm are lines of old-growth trees. This is the perfect place to fill a buck tag. I parked my jeep about a mile upriver from the fields, then began walking along the tree line toward the area where the deer had mostly been feeding. At the opposite end of the field, there is a large haystack where all the harvested alfalfa is stored. As I saw it coming into my field of view, I felt the hair stand up on the back of my neck. I kneeled down and viewed the area through my binoculars. I could see a very tall, large man walking briskly towards me from behind the haystack. I knew for a fact that I was supposed to be the only one hunting this farm on this night, as I had just spoken to my grandmother. Something inside me told me that I needed to get out of the area as fast as I could. I initially tried to turn around and walk back down the trees to my jeep, but given I have such short legs, this guy was quickly closing the gap. He was still several hundred yards from me, so I decided to try to cross the river instead. I found that the river was too muddy and deep for me to safely cross. I thought my only option was attempt to get a signal on my cell phone. When he walked across a small ditch and disappeared from my line of sight, I quickly darted into the corn and kept quiet. I could hear him walking closer and closer. I desperately tried to call my husband. Back then, the closest cell towers were over 30 miles away, and cell service was extremely spotty. I could not connect to my husband or 911. By this point, the man was within 100 yards of me. I could hear him ripping corn out, stomping around, and loudly cussing.
Where the f*** did you go?
Another issue is, it was getting dark quickly. I definitely did not want to be in the dark, alone with this man. I watched him for a few minutes, and was able to determine that he did not have a gun. After weighing my options, I decided to step out, and see if I could de-escalate the situation, as I work in healthcare and work with mentally unstable people all the time. I stepped out of the corn. "Hi, I'm sorry if I interrupted your hunt or something. I didn't mean to cause you any harm," I said with a sweet smile on my face. I made sure there was at least 80 yards of distance between us. His eyes locked with mine, and it was obvious that there was something wrong with this man. He stood about 6'5" tall. His clothes were absolutely filthy, stained with what appeared to be his own waste and sweat. His shirt was torn and had dried blood on it. His face was crooked, as if he had a stroke prior, and he slurred his words.
"There you are!"
he yelled. He reached down and grabbed a massive stick. I'm talking a stick at least 5 feet long. He could have easily killed me with this stick. I stood my ground, grabbed my rifle from my bag, and pointed it at him. He stopped holding the stick. We looked at each other for a second. Then he began yelling.
"Do you know whose farm you're on?"
I stated, yes, this is my grandmother's farm. I've hunted it my whole life. The veins began to pop out of his head.
"No, this is not. My wife is hunting in this cornfield and you ruined it. Because of you, she missed a huge buck, you stupid bitch."
He became so enraged he started making strange growling sounds and started spitting everywhere. I was running through the options in my head at this point when he suddenly started to lunge at me. I turned the safety off my rifle and loudly stated, "Stop! I will shoot you if I have to." He froze in his tracks and just stared at me for about 30 seconds before dropping the stick. He grunted loudly, with his eyes darting around. "Listen, I don't want to have to do something that we will both regret. I am very sorry that I ruined your hunt. If you turn around and walk away from me, I will leave," I calmly explained. I could see him thinking hard about what to do next when he mumbled,
Fine.
Then he turned around, stomping towards the haystack. My heart was about to beat out of my chest. I was not about to turn my back on this man, though. I watched until he walked a distance away, and then I darted back into the corn. I thought back on how he said I spooked a buck and ruined his wife's hunt, but that did not make any sense. I had a good view of the whole field, and there were no deer present. I decided to observe him through my binoculars. I watched him climb up to the haystack and get into a small 2-door white car. He quickly peeled out of the haystack lot. I was able to catch that the car had California license plates, but nothing more. I live nowhere near California. He took off down the road, and he was alone. No one else was in that vehicle. I ran back to my Jeep and locked myself in it. I sped home as fast as I could and told my husband what happened. I had never seen this man in my life, and neither had my husband based on my description. We live in a community of about 200 people. Born and raised here, we know everyone. I called our local sheriff, and they came out and took a statement. I took them to the haystack where he was parked, and we found a knife lying on the ground. Of course, nothing was able to be done, as I wasn't able to get a plate number or name from the man. To this day, I still have no idea what the man's intentions were, even though I could guess on a few. It's been 8 years, and I have never seen this man again. I also decided that I'd be hunting with a buddy from then on. I grew up attending a Christian church from birth. It was very small and family-like, and we loved it as kids. In 2008, when I was about 9 years old, we found out that someone had taken their own life in our church. It was super strange and unexpected for the congregation. A few months later, we learned that the pastor's wife had passed away. He had beaten her and tried to stage a car accident. When she died, our pastor held a memorial service for her at the church. That Sunday, my family and I showed up to support him and her family. You know how at funerals people stand in line and you usually walk up and hug them? It was the same thing here. We walked up to offer our respects, and I hugged him. He got away with it for over a year before people started questioning the whole situation. During that time, he continued preaching at our church and went on with his life as usual. Fast forward a little, and they realized that my pastor had killed his wife. But then some people began questioning the death of his first wife from 1999. This man had killed 2 wives. He got away with one and almost got away with the second. As for the person who took their own life, we later found out that he did it because the pastor was having an affair with another married member of the church, presumably the man's wife. I was not only close to this man, but I had slept in the same house as him during our Bible retreats. It's super creepy and has given me a lot of trust issues. I am a 19-year-old Muslim girl, and this is my story. I visited my homeland for my brother's wedding in 2013. I was 7 years old at the time. The house my family and I were staying in, which is also our own house, is located near the cemetery area, surrounded by trees, abandoned houses that people haven't lived in for years, and very few lights. One night, I was walking from my house to my uncle's house, which was at the end of the street, about a 5-minute walk. To get there, you have to cross in front of the cemetery, or take another road, which would take a lot longer. As I had been living there for quite some time, I was used to it. This night was also my birthday, and I was on my way to my party. I went alone, as everyone else was already at my uncle's house. As I passed the cemetery, I saw a shadow that looked like a little boy. From what I could see, he looked younger than me, with no shirt, just black shorts. All I saw was his back, and he was just standing there, facing the wall in a corner. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it must have just been a kid playing while their father or grandfather was praying at the mosque in the middle of the cemetery. so I called out to see if it was someone that I knew, but he didn't react. He just stayed there. I watched for a moment, but then my mum called me to come inside quickly to cut the cake. I only looked away for a few seconds, and when I looked back, he was gone. I thought maybe he ran away, so I didn't think much of it and went on with my day. A few days passed. There were still a few days left before leaving the island and returning to the capital city where I live. During this time, I kept having strange dreams about being followed or chased by something or someone. It wasn't clear at first, but it started getting worse. I began seeing the little boy in my dreams. That's when I knew something wasn't normal. I told my mum about it, and she suggested I pray and do zikr to help. It stopped happening for a while, but after we returned to the capital, I grew distant from my prayers and zikr. The dreams started again, and I still didn't continue my prayers. I just let it happen. The dreams didn't stop. I started getting paranoid and even began seeing the boy inside my house when I was alone. He couldn't get close to me, but he was there. I saw him, and I felt his presence. Every time it happened, it felt like he was taking my soul from my body. It felt like the whole house was shaking. Now that I think about it, I realized he had no face at all. After a month of this, the physical reactions got worse, and I decided to tell my parents about it. They brought a man to perform ruqya on me. That day, while he was reciting the Quran, I felt comfortable and thought I had fallen asleep, but my mum explained to me that while he was reciting, I was laughing, my eyes were shaking, and I was stiff the whole time. When he finished, I woke up as if nothing had happened. Now, I'm safe from it, but I still have ruqya done on me occasionally, just in case. But to this day, all of it still scares me. My parents got married while still in high school. I wouldn't recommend this. The 12th grade to be exact. They were legal adults. I came just a year later when my mum was 19 and my dad was 20. We lived in a one-bedroom upstairs apartment in a crappy complex. I slept in my crib until I started climbing out of it and finding my way into my parents' bed or into trouble. When I was 4, my parents decided that I needed my own room, so they upgraded to a 2-bedroom downstairs apartment in the same complex. They fought horribly all the time, but outside of that, everything was pretty normal. I made a few friends with other children around the complex, and a cousin with her 3 kids also lived in the complex. Everything was fine until a new neighbor moved in next door when I was 6. Immediately, this lady didn't like me, and she didn't hide it. I was at school when she moved in, but on the weekends when I went out to ride my big wheel bike and play, she stood in her door and glared at me with the most hateful look a person could give a child. To be honest, I didn't like her either. Something about her bothered my spirit greatly. Though at the time, I didn't understand why. It was like she could sense my presence outside and would literally spawn outdoors just to stare daggers at me and mutter things under her breath. I felt an evil presence around her and started making a cross with my fingers whenever I saw her. This enraged her, and she lied and told my mum that I gave her the middle finger. My mum believed me instead. Strange things started happening in my room at night. I had a rocking horse. It was beautiful, and I enjoyed playing on it. However, it started rocking on its own whenever I tried to sleep. My parents heard this as the springs made a distinctive noise. I also had one of those dolls whose eyes open and close depending on if it's lying down or sitting up. The doll's eyes would sometimes remain open while lying down, or it would blink, scaring the crap out of me. There were strange knocking noises in my walls. My parents heard this as well, and they allowed me to sleep with them in bed. One day, my mum and I got locked out of our apartment. This was before everyone had cell phones, the 90s, and our cousin wasn't home. Against my pleas, My mum knocked on the neighbour's door to use her phone. She let us in, glaring at me the entire time. I never let go of my mum's hand or came from behind her legs. In her house, on her wall, were multiple upside-down crosses, strange-looking masks, some with horns. There were candles everywhere and small colourful bottles with powder in them. My mum looked around like, what the heck? But kept her composure. She held my hand tighter, made the phone call to my dad at his job to hurry back, and we quickly exited the apartment after thanking the woman. She watched me as we left. My mum told my dad everything, and he told his father, my grandfather, who was a pastor. He immediately brought us a bottle of prayed-over olive oil, holy oil, to anoint our house. My mum also told her side of the family, who were very strict Christians, and they were, for lack of a better word, flabbergasted, and started a prayer meeting. A few days later, we noticed at our back door a white powder substance across the threshold. My mum poured some of the oil on it, and it absorbed it and disappeared. The woman later tried to offer me some candy, which I declined, even though I loved sweets. My nickname was Sugar because I loved junk food so much. I had made friends with a little girl in the complex who lived on the other side. One day, she had some soft chews and offered me one. Like an idiot, I accepted and ate it. It didn't take long before I fell violently ill. Fever, sweating, skin darkened, dark circles around my eyes. Nothing given to me at the doctor's helped. I couldn't keep anything down. On intuition, my mum asked if I had accepted or eaten anything from anyone, and I confessed to accepting candy from a friend. She asked around and found out that the girl was the granddaughter of our next-door neighbour. My dad called my grandfather, and my mum called her family. They anointed me with holy oil and made a prayer circle around me and started speaking in tongues. I was in and out of consciousness. My grandfather lifted me up and made me drink some of the oil. I remember it burning my throat. Suddenly, I had to throw up. I leaped from the couch where I was lying and sprinted to the bathroom, where I started throwing up thick black sludge. A lot came out. My mum was shaking and on the verge of tears. Everyone continued praying in tongues. I threw up for a while until it was all out. I suddenly felt a lot better. I was fussed at from accepting food from strangers, even friends. The adults talked while I rested. After a few days, the woman saw that I was fine. This time, I glared back at her because I was angry. I was young, but I understood that she had tried to poison me for no reason. I made the cross sign again with my fingers, and she went back into her house and slammed the door. Sometime after that, she moved out. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and my childhood friend Joe and I were outside whenever we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and would stay in the woods all weekend, would only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen, would build shelters, set traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous, and would likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished, and we hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun that we did it multiple times. We never had a problem. After high school, Joe and I went our separate ways. We both left home but always stayed in touch and tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family during the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, Joe and I got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, and we started out early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off at our usual spot that we used to start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd go in the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave her what the hell, and off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge, sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thickly forested area, with the trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days too. We'd walk around a little bit to make sure some guy's house wasn't just over a hill, and that we weren't actually camping in someone's yard. We walked maybe 100 feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from the top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom, about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road leading to it. From where we were, it didn't look like anyone was inside either. All was quiet, no movement, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw that it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It had looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on the top of the place, also withered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in the front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to the spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks, go to sleep, and move on early in the morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks and shot the breeze, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation went a little like this. "Do you hear that? What the f*** is that? It sounds like people singing." And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could figure out where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods, just like in the old days. The moon was barely out, but it provided just enough light so you wouldn't walk into a tree. It was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked like candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We were about a football field's length away, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher that you'd see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, the single male voice would say something, and a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I actually covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the f*** out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed,
"They're coming out!"
We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out very well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out of the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. Some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights started to move toward us and the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our stuff, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction that we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. Eventually, we stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew that a town was about 15 minutes down the road, so we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that ever happened to me, out in the woods. I've never had a lot of friends, but that never really bothered me. I'm the kind of guy who does things alone anyway. A lot of people think that's weird, but whatever. One of the few things that interests me is urban exploration, checking out abandoned places, seeing what's left behind, taking a few pictures. So, when I heard about the Danvers State Hospital in Massachusetts, I figured I'd make the drive and check it out. I'd read a little about the place. It used to be a massive mental hospital back in the day, the kind where they did lobotomies and electroshock therapy, classic horror movie stuff. It closed down in the 90s, but parts of it was still standing, and that's what I wanted to see. Of course, most of it had been torn down or turned into apartments, but I'd heard there were still a few original buildings hidden in the back, deep in the woods. It took me a while to find a way in, but after wandering around the perimeter, I found a hole in the fence. I squeezed through and made my way up the overgrown path. The building loomed in front of me, windows shattered, doors barely hanging on their hinges. It looked like a skeleton of its former self. Inside, it was cold and damp. Even though it was a pretty warm day outside, the air smelled like mold and old wood, and the walls were covered in graffiti. It was dead silent, except for the occasional drip of water from a leaky ceiling. I walked slowly, taking it all in. The place was a maze of long, dark hallways, all leading to empty rooms where patients used to live. I was halfway down one of these hallways when I heard it, a faint shuffling sound, like someone was dragging their feet. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. It was coming from one of the rooms up ahead. I told myself it was probably just an animal or maybe the wind pushing debris around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I walked a little closer, and the noise stopped. I was standing right outside one of the rooms now. The door was half open, creaking softly in the draft. I don't know why, but I pushed it open, just to see what was inside. At first, it looked like an ordinary room, peeling wallpaper, broken bed frame, the usual. But then I saw her. There, leaning against the far wall, was an old woman. She was dressed in this faded, old-fashioned dress. The kind you'd expect to see in a black and white photo. She was hunched over, staring at the floor, her grey hair hanging in front of her face. I stood there, frozen. I didn't know what to do. My brain was racing, trying to make sense of it. There was no way anyone was still living here, especially not an old woman like her. But she was real. I could hear her breathing. She didn't move at first. Then, slowly, she lifted her head and looked right at me. Her eyes were sunken and dark, like she hadn't slept in years. And then she smiled. It wasn't a normal smile. It was this wide, unnatural grin that stretched way too far across her face. That was enough for me. I didn't wait to see what she was going to do next. I bolted, slamming the door behind me and sprinting back down the hallway. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was out of the building and back through the hole in the fence. When I finally got back to my car, I sat there for a while, trying to calm down. I kept telling myself it was just some squatter or maybe my mind playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case.
Haha, I have stolen Misfit Horror's voice. Subscribe so I don't also take his soul. You can always unsubscribe later, so there's nothing to lose. Plus, it's free. Ha 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 ha. It's up to you, viewer. Now enjoy the rest of these scary, true urban exploration stories.
Ha 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 ha.
I never liked working alone. My job at the old factory complex was usually pretty boring, sitting in the booth, doing rounds, making sure no one got inside. But the place was huge, and it was easy to get paranoid when it was just me. The company was cheap though, and any time my co-worker called in sick, they'd stick me on solo shifts. Just one guy patrolling a massive abandoned factory. Not exactly the best deterrent, but it's what they did. The factory had been shut down for years, since before I started working there. It used to manufacture God knows what, but now it was just a decaying maze of empty buildings, rusted machinery, and old loading docks. The lights barely worked, and half the time it felt like I was walking through a ghost town. That night, I was doing my usual routine, sitting in the security booth, watching the cameras, and every hour or so, walking around to check for any signs of trouble. Usually, the biggest issue was keeping out kids who wanted to explore or tag the place with graffiti. The area was fenced off, but determined people could always find a way in. I was just finishing up around when I noticed something odd on one of the camera feeds. It was the back entrance, the side closest to the woods. A group of people, maybe 6 or 7 of them, were walking straight towards the factory. At first, I thought they were just more thrill seekers, maybe a bunch of teens looking to mess around in the old building. But as I zoomed in on the feed, I noticed something was off. They weren't dressed like normal explorers. They were wearing long, dark robes, hoods pulled up to cover their faces, and they weren't just casually walking either. They were moving in a straight line, almost in unison, like they had a purpose. My first thought was some weird prank. Maybe they were trying to film a horror video for YouTube, but as they reached the entrance, they all stopped at the same time, turning to look at each other. Then, without a word, they entered the building. Now, I'm not easily spooked, but I wasn't exactly eager to approach a group of people dressed like a cult, wandering into an abandoned factory. Still, it was my job to check it out. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and started towards the back of the building. My hand was already hovering over my phone, ready to call the cops if things got weird. When I reached the back entrance, I stepped inside and immediately heard soft murmuring, like chanting. My heart started racing as I moved quietly down the hall, following the sounds. It was coming from one of the large production rooms, the ones that would hardly ever check because no one could easily get to them without being noticed. But these people, whoever they were, had made it there without me even seeing them in person. As I approached the room, I could see them now. They had formed a circle in the middle of the floor, each of them standing perfectly still, heads bowed. In the center of the circle, there was some kind of symbol, something large, maybe drawn in chalk or paint. I couldn't make it out from where I was standing, but the whole thing felt wrong. I called out,
Hey, security! You need to get out of here.
My voice echoed through the factory, but none of them moved. The chanting, though, stopped. Dead silence. Then, slowly, they all turned to face me at once. I couldn't see their faces beneath the hoods, but I could feel their eyes locked on me. For a second, no one moved. We just stood there, staring at each other. And then, without warning, they all sprinted toward me. I didn't think, didn't wait. I turned and ran. My flashlight bounced in my hand as I sprinted down the hallway, the sound of their footsteps pounding behind me. I've never run so fast in my life. I could hear them getting closer, their breath heavy, their feet slapping against the concrete. I made it out of the building and saw my car in the distance, parked just outside the booth. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, not daring to look back. I could feel them closing in, their presence right behind me. I slammed into my car, fumbling for my keys, and barely managed to get the door open before I threw myself inside. I slammed the door shut just as the first fist hit the window, then another. The entire group was there, surrounding the car, banging on the windows, kicking at the doors. The glass started to crack under the force of their hits. I jammed the key into the ignition, turned it, and floored the gas. As I peeled out of the parking lot, one of them darted in front of me. I didn't have time to stop. There was a sickening thud as the car bounced, but I didn't slow down. I just kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the police station. I stumbled out of the car and ran inside, breathless and rambling about the group at the factory. The cops didn't really know what to make of it, but they sent a few officers to check it out. I sat there in the station for what felt like hours, trying to calm down. Finally, one of the officers came back. He said they didn't find anyone at the factory, no sign of the group I'd seen. But they did find something. In the exact spot where I'd seen the group standing, there was a pentagram drawn on the floor, surrounded by strange markings. The officer told me it looked like some kind of ritual site, but there was no trace of anyone being there. I never went back to that factory after that. I quit the next day. It was Mike's idea to check out our old elementary school. We hadn't been there in years, not since they shut it down a few months ago. Sunland Park Elementary used to be the center of our little town in El Paso, Texas, but budget cuts and declining enrollment turned it into just another forgotten place. The last time we saw it, they boarded up the windows, put up a chain link fence, and left it to rot. We were bored, hanging out at Mike's place when he suggested we head over there. I wasn't really in the mood, but I didn't want to seem like a pussy either. "Come on, man," he said, grabbing his flashlight. "How often is it that we get to explore a place that we actually know?" I agreed. The idea of walking through our old school, the place where we spent years playing on the jungle gym and messing around in class, sounded kind of cool. But it wasn't exactly the same place anymore. Now, it was just another abandoned building, probably crawling with rats and worse. When we got there, the place looked even worse than I imagined. The fence was still up, but parts of it had been cut open, letting in anyone who wanted to sneak through. We crawled through the gap and stood in front of the entrance. The windows were smashed, and graffiti covered the walls. I remembered how it used to look, with bright colours and kids running everywhere. Now, it was just dead. We got inside pretty easily. The front doors were unlocked, probably from someone else breaking in earlier. Once we stepped in, it hit me how weird it felt. It was like the whole building was frozen in time, but with everything covered in dust and decay. There were still old desks and chairs scattered around, like the teachers left in a hurry and never came back. We wandered down the hallway, our footsteps echoing off the tile floors. Everything looked smaller than I remember, probably because we'd grown so much since we were last there. I couldn't shake this eerie feeling though, like the place was watching us. Every creak or random noise had me on edge, but I didn't want to let Mike see that. We passed by the old gym, where the door was barely hanging on its hinges. Mike wanted to check it out, but I was more interested in our old classrooms. Room 204 was where we had Mrs. Jensen for 3rd grade, and I was curious to see if anything was still there. I nudged Mike, and we headed that way. As we were walking, I noticed something. Footsteps that weren't ours. They were faint, coming from further down the hall, but they definitely weren't the sounds we were making. I glanced at Mike, and he heard it too. We abruptly stopped, straining to listen.
Hello?
Mike called out, but his voice cracked a little, and I could tell he was freaked. We didn't hear anything in response, but the footsteps kept coming. I turned my flashlight down the hall, and that's when we saw him. A guy standing near the end of the hallway, half hidden in the shadows. He was tall, probably in his mid-30s, and wore this ragged hoodie with the hood pulled up. His face was partially obscured, but I could tell he was staring right at us. My stomach twisted in knots. For a second, I thought about bolting towards the entrance, but I felt like I couldn't move. The guy took a step toward us, and Mike whispered, "Run!" But before we could take off, the guy raised his hands, like he was showing he wasn't a threat. He didn't say anything at first, just kept his hands up, walking toward us slowly. "You guys shouldn't be here," he finally said. His voice was rough, like he hadn't spoken in a while. "I ain't gonna hurt you, but trust me, this ain't the kind of place you want to be hanging out." We didn't respond right away, mostly because we were both still freaking out. But something about the way he talked calmed me down a little. He wasn't rushing us, wasn't trying to scare us anymore. Mike spoke first. Do you live here?" The guy shrugged, looking away for a second before nodding. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. Don't got nowhere else to go." He stepped closer. Now I could see him better. He looked rough, like life had chewed him up and spat him out. His eyes were tired, his face gaunt. We relaxed a bit, realizing he wasn't some psycho or anything. Just a guy down on his luck, probably just using the school as a place to crash. He leaned against the wall, running a hand over his face. "I've seen kids like you come in here before, thinking it's some kind of playground. But it ain't safe here, man. You don't know what kind of people you run into around here." He chuckled dryly. "Lucky for you, I'm the harmless kind." Mike and I stood there, unsure of what to say. It was weird, standing in the hallway of our old school, talking to this random dude who'd probably been living in the place for months. It was awkward, but it didn't feel dangerous anymore. Just sad. "Well, thanks for the heads up," Mike said, finally breaking the silence. "Yeah," the guy replied, giving us a half smile. "Just take care of yourselves. This place ain't what it used to be." We nodded, and without another word, we headed back the way we came. I didn't want to push it by asking more questions, and honestly, I just wanted to get out of there. As I walked back to the entrance, I glanced over my shoulder. The guy was still leaning against the wall, watching us leave, but he didn't follow. When we got outside, the fresh air hit me, and I realized I had been holding my breath for way too long. Mike and I didn't talk much on the way home. I think we were both trying to process what just happened. Sunland was our childhood, but seeing what it's become, I don't think we'll go back anytime soon. It all started during the pandemic. I think it was the year 2021 or something. My little sister and I moved into my mum's house due to reasons of my dad moving away for work. The house was okay for most, nothing out of the ordinary. That was until strange things started happening. Doors started opening and closing on their own, people walking around the house despite me being alone, and hearing your name being called even though no one was there. But it wasn't something I couldn't handle, so I just shrugged it off. And this particular night, I couldn't fall asleep, which is weird because usually around this time of night, I would be blacked out. I felt a presence watching me. Now I normally don't get scared easily, but this time, I felt like crapping my pants. So in an attempt to distract myself, I scrolled aimlessly on my phone. Maybe I was just imagining things. Soon I drifted into my night slumber. At around 2:47 a.m, I woke up with the urge of using the restroom. I walked down and out of my room, but went into an immediate halt when I saw a lady. What was she doing standing against my bedroom door's frame? Sure, it was creepy, But I pushed those thoughts aside and went to the restroom. I walked back. She was still there, aimlessly staring at me with her dead eyes and eerily creepy smile. I rubbed my eyes. I blinked twice. She was still there. I jumped on my bed and hid inside the blankets. I dared not to look at her. I went into a silent prayer. She was still there. I wanted to cry so badly. She was drawing nearer by the second. I continued on with my silent prayer, praying for her to leave me alone. She loomed over me and started to choke me. I couldn't breathe. I was screaming at the top of my lungs, kicking and squirming my arms and legs. Next thing I know it, my mum came in to check on me, and she disappeared. She said it was probably a nightmare. I knew it was more than that. I haven't heard or seen her since, but I still know she's lurking in the depths of this house, preying on me and getting ready to pounce at any moment. I just wanted to share a story that happened to me. I wanted to share this story to spread an awareness and to see if anyone else has had this happen to them. It was a very disturbing and chilling event. I was with my older brother in my basement. I was about 16, 17 or so, probably 2020 era, around midnight. I remember this happening during the COVID-19 lockdown, so probably just after the fall because it was a winter night. I was with my older brother playing some Nintendo Switch when someone called my brother with a 1-800 number, which is a long distance from where we live, Canada. I told him to answer the phone. After some hesitation, I told him to answer it and put it on speaker. We thought it would be a voice-recorded message or a scammer trying to get something out of us. We answered the phone and greeted the person on the other line. And there was nothing heard. About 5 seconds later, a distressed and panicked voice of a woman was heard. I remember her saying these exact words.
Hello? Is someone there? Please help me. Please help me.
And she started hysterically crying and sobbing on the other end. She started hyperventilating, and almost like a manic screaming started. I had absolutely no idea what to do, because I was so frozen in fear. We declined the call, and I've never answered an unknown caller again. I don't know. Is this some kind of sick troll? Was she genuinely in danger? Was she going through an episode, or did she have some kind of mental health disorder? I don't know, and I never will. But it still freaks me out. Earlier in the year, I had a weird experience. Before I tell my story, let me just say, it takes me nearly 2 hours to fall asleep each night. Trust me, I was still awake. I don't have any sleeping issues/conditions. Besides, it takes me a long time to fall asleep. As we all know, once we turn off all the lights in our bedroom, it's total darkness. Then after 5 to 10 minutes, our eyes adjust and it's no longer total darkness. When my experience occurred, it wasn't total darkness. Here's my story. As I'm laying down, staring at the ceiling, my vision suddenly changed. I saw total darkness, the darkest black you could possibly see, and special white lights. The lights were white, the same color as a flashlight torch. The best way I can describe it is, it was like looking up in the dark sky and watching fireworks go off, except the lights were white. Honestly, it was a beautiful sight that lasted about 5 seconds. After about 2 seconds of witnessing this, out loud I said, "WTF?" Then in my head, I asked myself, what just happened? I honestly was not scared, just confused. I could attempt to draw what I saw to show you guys, but it would come out looking horrible. I desperately want to tell this story to someone who is extremely experienced, so I can get an answer on what this means. I'm no stranger to unexplained/paranormal experiences. I have another interesting story that I will share tomorrow regarding a small ball of electricity, a ball that was about half the size of a tennis ball. Although short, I hope you guys enjoyed my story. I want to share a real experience that I had about 7 years ago. This might not be as interesting as it could be because it's real. I'm not trying to make things up for the sake of entertainment. I just want to get this off my chest, as it was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. Around the age of 19, I was disqualified from the military due to a medical disqualification. I wasn't too sure what to do with my life since this was a lifelong dream. I felt very lost. I did a lot of soul searching during this time, studied many religions and philosophies. At some point I got into occultism, law of attraction, meditation, and finally astral projection. To keep it short, I started meditating to attract into my life the things that I wanted, and I also started to practice astral projection. After a few weeks, my aunt started to come into my room, scared, and began to question what I was doing. I told her that I was meditating quite frequently, sometimes up to 3 hours a day. Why was she asking? She told me that something very weird had just happened in the house. In fact, for a few days now, several weird things had been happening. She told me while they were watching TV, the front door of the house unlocked itself, and the door had just been slammed open. They told me things had just been falling off counters, and my uncle had been seeing things from the corner of his eyes. She didn't tell me to stop. She actually seemed intrigued. My aunt is into crystals and all kinds of groovy-doo stuff. I kept this going. I wasn't able to astral project yet, but I was able to get parts of my body to leave. As weird as that sounds, I was able to remove my arm from my arm. It's a very odd feeling to describe. It feels like your arms are paralyzed. Yet another one you can fully manipulate and feel it coming out of it. I was also able to do this with my right leg. For those of you who are not understanding what astral projection is, it means leaving your body. I'm not sure if your soul leaves your body or you project it mentally. All I know is that it's very real, but it's a thing. Supposedly, you are able to soul travel by doing this. In any case, a couple weeks go by and my uncle and aunt need to be gone for a couple days, and I have the house to myself. So what do? Have a girl over like any other normal dude would? No, I meditate and try to leave my body. At this point, I'm obsessed. For the first time, I fall asleep while meditating, and what proceeds to happen is one of the most traumatic and terrifying things to ever happen to me. Who am I kidding? It's by far the most terrifying experience of my life, and it haunts me to this day. This is the part of the story I don't like telling anyone, because they dismiss it as a nightmare, or it's just sleep paralysis, bro. I don't care what you decide what to call what I'm about to tell you. If you want to label it as fake, it was more real than life to me. I have astral projected a few times. I never saw anything very interesting other than my own home, freaking out my dogs, and mostly what I do is fly over lakes, factories, and cities at night. I can never do it for very long. I have not mastered it, and nowadays I avoid the practice altogether, although it happens involuntarily from time to time. What I experienced in this instance was different. It felt more physical, it felt more real, and I was attacked by God knows what. I wake up, laying flat on my bed, facing up, arms wide open and legs spread apart. The TV is on. The show Ink Master is running. It's night, but the room has a natural light to it, almost like a full moon. I see a shadow in the corner of the room. I try to get up, but I can't move. I'm paralyzed. I start being able to move, but I feel heavy, like trying to swim underwater. The shadow gets closer to me, and then crawls on top of my body. This is embarrassing to say, and I usually leave this part out of the story. This thing proceeds to put its hands between my legs and press and squeeze, you know. I feel immense physical pain. There is actually something groping my body and really hurting me. I try to scream, but I can't. I start saying, "The power of Christ compels you," over and over, but it does nothing. My back starts to bend in an arch and I'm slightly levitating over my bed. Everything is happening very silently, which allows me to hear very loud footsteps coming from the kitchen. While this is all happening, a man walks from the kitchen into my room. I can barely see or look, but he is a middle-aged man wearing a suit. Looks very old-fashioned. After several attempts of asking, my words finally come out. "Who are you?" The man standing in the corner of the room states, "My name is Luca." I then asked, concerned, "Lucifer?" He then states, "No, Luca." The painful back arching and floating continues for a while, when suddenly it stops. I fall on my bed, and it's suddenly daylight. Inkmaster is still on, and I can hear birds chirping. I never woke up from this, like waking up from a dream. It simply stopped, and I was still awake. I spent the entire day looking things up online, trying to make sense of what happened. When it came night again, the same thing happens again. The same entity, or whatever it is, grips me the same way and hurts me. You've got to understand, the pain is very physical and excruciating. I can feel its hands and fingers, and this time I'm very pissed off. For one reason or another, this time I'm not afraid, and I start trying to strangle it. I start asking it, "Get me out of my body so I can murder it." And suddenly, it all stops, just like that. After this second episode, that never happened again. From time to time, I am still attacked by an entity that looks like me, and am forced to fight it, but these are more like vivid nightmares. Nothing like the situation I just described. I quit meditating, I quit trying to astral project, and this situation never happened again. I still involuntarily astral project in my sleep sometimes, but it's very uneventful. I don't see other entities or have bad or good things happen. I just float over a lake near my house and enjoy the view for the most part. Maybe there's more I could share, but I think I have shared enough. Thanks for getting this far.